Chapter 1, Part 1 of Hunting in Many Lands. Our story is entitled Hunting in East Africa by W.A. Chanler. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hunting in East Africa, Part 1. In the month of July, 1889, I was encamped in the Tibet forest, 250 miles from the east coast, and at the eastern foot of Mount Kilimanjaro. I was accompanied by my servant, George Galvin, an American lad, 17 years old, and had a following of 130 Zanzibaris. My battery consisted of the following weapons: one 8-bore smooth, using a cartridge loaded with 10 drams of powder and a 2-ounce spherical ball, one 5.77 and one 4.50 express rifle, and one 12-bore paradox. All of these were made by Messrs. Holland and Holland. My servant carried an old 12-bore rifle made by Lang, intended to shoot 4.5 drams of powder, but whose cartridges he recklessly loaded with more than 7, and a 45-90 Winchester of the model of 1886. Tibet Forest has been often described by pens far abler than mine, so I will not attempt to do this. It is inhabited by a most friendly tribe of savages, who at the time of my visit to them possessed sufficient food to be able to supply the wants of my caravan. I therefore made it a base at which I could leave the major part of my following, and from which I could with comfort and safety venture forth on shooting trips, accompanied by only a few men. The first of these excursions was made to the shores of Lake Djepe, 6 hours' march from Taveta, for the purpose of shooting hippos. I took with me my whole battery and 13 men. This unlucky number perhaps influenced my fortunes, for I returned to Taveta empty-handed and fever-stricken, after a stay on the shores of the lake lasting some days. However, my experiences were interesting, if only because they were in a great measure the result of ignorance. Up to this time my sporting experience had dealt only with snipe and turkey shooting in Florida, for on my road from the coast the little game scene was too wary to give me a chance of putting a rifle to my shoulder. The shores of Lake Djepe, where I pitched my tent, were quite flat, and separated from the open water of the lake by a wide belt of swamp growth. I had brought with me, for the purpose of constructing a raft, several bundles of the stems of a large palm growing in Taveta, and these were dry and as light as cork. In a few hours' time my men constructed a raft 15 feet in length and 5 feet in width. On trial it was found capable of supporting 2 men, but even with this light load it sank some inches below the surface of the water. I fastened a deal box on the forward end as a seat, and instructed one of the men, who said he understood boatman's work, to stand in the stern and punt the craft along with a pole. During the night my slumbers were constantly disturbed by the deep, ominous grunting of the hippopotami, which, as if to show their contempt for my prowess, chose a path to their feeding grounds, which led them within a few yards of my camp. The night, though starlit, was too dark for a shot, so I curbed my impatience till the morning. As most people are aware, the day begins in the tropics as nearly as possible at 6 o'clock, and lasts 12 hours. 2 hours before dawn I was up, and fortifying myself against the damp morning air with a good breakfast of roast chicken, rice, and coffee. My men, wrapped in their thin cotton shirts, lay about the fires on the damp ground, seemingly unmindful of rheumatism and fever, and only desirous to sleep as long as possible. I awoke my crew at a little after 5, and he, unassisted, launched the raft. The swamp grass buoyed it up manfully, so that it looked as if it disdained to touch the yellow waters of the lake. When it had been pushed along till the water was found to be 2 feet deep, I had myself carried to the raft and seated myself on the box. I was clad only in a flannel shirt, and carried my 5.77 with 10 rounds of ammunition. As we slowly started on our way, My men woke up one by one and shouted cheering words to us, such as, "Look out for the crocodiles!" "If master dies, who'll pay us?" These cries, added to the dismal chill of the air, and my boatman's only too apparent dislike of his job, almost caused me to turn back, but of course that was out of the question. Half an hour from the shore found me on the edge of the open water, and, as if to endorse my undertaking, day began to break. That sunrise! Opposite me the rough outlines of the Yellowstone Mountains, rising several thousand feet, lost their shadows one by one, and far to the right towered Mount Kilimanjaro, nearly 4 miles high, its snowy rounded top roseate with the soft light of dawn. But in Africa at least one's higher sensibilities are dulled by the animal side of his nature, and I fear I welcomed the sun more for the warmth of its rays than for the beautiful and fleeting vision it produced. Then the hippos. While the sun was rising, my raft was not at rest, but was being propelled by slow, strong strokes toward the center of the lake, and as the darkness lessened I saw the surface of the lake dotted here and there by spots, which soon resolved themselves into the black box-like heads of my game. They were, to all appearance, motionless, and appeared quite unconscious or indifferent to the presence, in their particular domain, of our strange craft and its burden. I approached them steadily, going more slowly as the water grew deeper and more time was needed for the pulling out and dipping in of the pole. When, however, I had reached a position some 150 yards from the nearest group, 5 in number, they all, with a loud snort, faced me. I kept on, despite the ardent prayer of the boatman, and when within 100 yards, and upon seeing 3 of the hippos disappear beneath the surface, I took careful aim and fired at the nearest of the remaining 2. I could see the splash of my bullet as it skipped harmlessly along the surface of the lake, and knew I had missed. At once all heads in sight disappeared. There must have been 50 in view when the sun rose. Presently, one by one, they reappeared, and this time, as if impelled by curiosity, came much closer than before. I took aim at one not 50 yards away, and could hear the thud of the bullet as it struck. I thought, as the hippo at once disappeared, that it was done for. I had not yet learned that the brain of these animals is very small, and that the only fatal shot is under the ear. After this shot, as after my first, all heads vanished, but this time I had to wait much longer ere they ventured to show themselves. When they did reappear, however, it was too close for comfort. One great head, blinking its small eyes and holding its little horse-like ears at attention, was not 20 feet away, and another was still closer on my other side. While hesitating at which to shoot, I lost my opportunity, for they both ducked simultaneously. I was riveted to my uncomfortable seat, and I could hear my boatman murmuring "Allah" with fright, when slowly but steadily I felt the raft rise under my feet. Instinctively I remembered I had but one .577 rifle, and hastened, my hands trembling, to fasten it with a loose rope's end to the raft. My boatman yelled with terror, and at that fearful cry the raft splashed back in the water, and all was again still. One of the hippos, either with its back or head, must have come in contact with the bottom of the raft as he rose to the surface. How far he would have gone had not the negro screamed I do not know, but as it was, it seemed as if we were being held in mid-air for many minutes. I fancy the poor brute was almost as frightened as we were, for he did not reappear near the raft. I now thought discretion the better part of valor, and satisfied myself with shooting at the animal from a somewhat greater distance. I hit 2 more in the head, and 2 who showed a good foot of their fat bodies above the water, in the sides. None floated on the surface, legs up, as I had been led to expect they would do. But the men assured me that they never come to the surface till sundown, no matter what time of day they may have been shot. This, needless to state, I afterward found is not true. My ammunition being exhausted and the sun blazing hot, I returned to camp. I awoke the next day feeling anything but energetic. Nevertheless, I set out to see what game the land held ready for the hunter, dissatisfied with his experiences on water. The country on the eastern side of Lake Chepee is almost flat, but is dotted here and there with low, steep, nice hills, stretching an indefinite line parallel to the lake and some 3 miles distant from it. I made my way toward these hills. On the way I put up some very small antelope, which ran in such an irregular manner that they presented no mark to my unskilled arm. We reached the hills, and I climbed one and scanned the horizon with my glasses. Far to the northwest I spied 2 black spots in a grassy plain. I gave the glasses to my gun-bearer, and he at once said, "Rhinoceros." I had never seen these beasts except in a menagerie, and the mention of the name brought me to my feet, eager to come to a closer acquaintance with them. The wind blew toward me, and the game was too far for the need of caution, so I walked rapidly in their direction. When I got to within 250 yards, I could quite easily distinguish the appearance of my quarry. They were lying down and apparently oblivious to my approach, perhaps asleep. My gun-bearer, a Swahili, now began to show an anxiety to turn back. This desire is, in many cases, the distinguishing trait of this race. On we went, but now cautiously and silently. The grass was about 2 feet high, so that by crawling on hands and knees one could conceal most of his body. But this position is not a pleasant one, with a blazing sun on the back, rough soil under the knees, and a 13-pound rifle in the hand. We got to within 50 yards. I looked back for the negro with my .577. He was lying flat on his stomach 50 yards to the rear. I stood up to beckon him, but he did not move. The rhinoceros did, and my attention was recalled to them by hearing loud snorts, and turning my head I saw the 2 beasts on their feet facing me. I had never shot an 8 bore in my life before, so it is not to be wondered at that the shock of the recoil placed me on my back. The animals were off before I could recover my feet, and my second barrel was not discharged. I ran after them, but the pace of a rhino is much faster than it looks, and I soon found pursuit useless. I returned to the place where they had lain, and on looking about found traces of fresh blood. My gun-bearer, as an explanation for his behaviour, said that rhinos were devils, and were not to be approached closely. He said I must be possessed of a miraculous power, or they would have charged and slain me. The next day fever laid me low, and though the attack was slight, some days elapsed before I could muster strength to take me back to Taveta. After a few days' rest in camp, strengthened by good food and spurred to fresh exertion by the barren result of my first effort, I set out again, accompanied by more men and in a different direction. My faith in myself received a pleasant encouragement the day before my departure. My head man came to me and said trade was at a standstill, and that the natives could not be induced to bring food to sell. On asking him why, I learned that the Taveta people had found 3 dead hippos in Lake Chepee and 1 rhino near its shores. Meat, a rare treat to them, even when not quite fresh, filled their minds and bodies, and they were proof even against the most tempting beads and the brightest claws. I cannot say that I shared my headman's anxiety. The fact that I had not laboured altogether in vain, even though others reaped the benefit of my efforts, filled me with a certain satisfaction. A day's march from Taveta brought me to the banks of an almost stagnant brook, where I made camp. The country round about was a plain studded with low hills, here thinly thatched with short grass, and there shrouded with thick brush, above which every now and then rose a giant acacia. The morning after my arrival I set out from camp with my 8 bore in my hands and hope in my heart. Not 200 yards from my tent I was startled by a snort, and then by the sight of 2 rhinos dashing across my path some 50 yards away. Well, this time I did not succumb to my gun's recoil, but had the doubtful satisfaction of seeing from a standing position the animals disappear in the bush. I made after them and found to my delight a clear trail of fresh blood. Eagerly pressing on, I was somewhat suddenly checked in my career by almost stumbling over a rhino apparently asleep on its side, with its head toward me. Bang went the 8-bore, and down I went. I was the only creature disturbed by the shot, as the rhino had been dead some minutes, slain by my first shot, and my satisfaction was complete when I found the hole made by my bullet. My men shouted and sang over this, the first fruits of my expedition, and even at this late day I forgive myself for the feeling of pride I then experienced. I have a table at home made of a piece of this animal's hide, and supported in part by one of his horns. The next day I made an early start, and worked till 4 p.m. with no result. Then, being some 8 miles from camp, I turned my face toward home. I had not gone far, and had reached the outskirts of an almost treeless savanna, when my gun-bearer brought me to a halt by the word Mabogo. This I knew meant buffalo. I adjusted my glass and followed the direction of my man's finger, and there, 500 yards away, I saw a solitary buffalo feeding slowly along toward 2 low bushes, but on the further side of them. I did not think what rifle I held, it was a .450, but dashed forward at once. My gun-bearer was more thoughtful, and brought with him my .577. We actually ran. When within 80 or 90 yards of the 2 bushes behind which the beast was now hidden, I slackened pace and approached more cautiously. My heart was beating and my hands were trembling with the exertion of running when I reached the nearest bush, and my nerves were not exactly steadied by meeting the vicious gaze of a large buffalo, who stood not 30 feet on the other side. My gun-bearer in an instant forced the .577 into my hands, and I took aim at the shoulder of the brute and fired, without knowing exactly what I was doing. The smoke cleared, and there, almost in his tracks, lay my first buffalo. His ignorance of my noisy and careless approach was apparently accounted for by his great age. His hide was almost hairless, and his horns worn blunt with many encounters. He must have been quite deaf and almost blind, or his behavior cannot be accounted for. The noise made by our approach, even with a favorable wind, was sufficient to frighten any animal, or at least put it on its guard. My men, who were dreadfully afraid of big game of all sorts, when they saw the buffalo lying dead, danced with joy and exultation. They kicked the dead body and shouted curses at it. Camp was distant a good hour's march, and the day was drawing to a close. The hungry howl of the hyenas warned me that my prize would soon be taken from me were it left unguarded. So piles of firewood were made, and the carcass surrounded by a low wall of flames. I left 3 men in charge, and set out for camp. There was but little light, and my way lay through bits of forest and much bush. Our progress was slow, and my watch read 10:30 p.m. before I reached my tent and bed. The following day I set out for a shooting ground distant 2 days' march from where I had been camped. Several rivers lay in my path, and 2 tribes of natives. These natives inhabit thick forest, and are in terror of strangers, as they are continually harassed by their neighbours. When they saw the smallness of my force, however, they endeavoured to turn me aside, but without success. Quiet and determination generally win with these people. The rivers gave me more trouble, as they were deep and swift of current, and my friends the natives had removed all bridges. But none of the streams exceeded 30 feet in width, and an hour's hard work with our axes always provided us with a bridge. The second day from my former camp brought me to the outskirts of the forest and the beginning of open country. I had hardly made camp before 3 Swahili traders came to me, and after the usual greetings began to weep in chorus. Their story was a common one. They had set out from Mombasa with 12 others to trade for slaves and ivory with the natives who inhabit the slopes of Kilimanjaro. Fortune had favoured them, and after 4 months they were on their way homeward with 18 slaves and 5 good-sized tusks. The first day's journey was just over when they were attacked by natives, 3 of their number slain, and all their property stolen. In the darkness they could not distinguish what natives attacked them, but their suspicions rested on the very tribe among whom they had spent the 4 months, and from whom they had purchased the ivory and slaves. I gave them a little cloth and some food, and a note to my people at Taveta to help them on their way. Of course they were slave traders, and as such ought possibly to have been beaten from my camp, but it is undoubtedly a fact that Mohammedans look on slave trading as a perfectly legitimate occupation, and if people are not breaking their own laws, I cannot see that a stranger should treat them as brigands and refuse them the least aid when in distress. I know that my point of view in this matter has few supporters in civilization. The next day, after a short march, I pitched my tent on the banks of a small stream, and then set out to prospect for game. I found nothing, but that night my slumbers were disturbed by the splashing and grunting of a herd of buffalo drinking. These sounds kept me awake, so that I was able to make a very early start, setting out with 4 men at 4:45. The natives had assured me that the buffalo came to drink about midnight, then fed slowly back to their favourite sleeping places in the thick bush, reaching there just about sunrise. By making such an early start, I hoped to come up with my quarry in the open places on the edge of the thick bush just before dawn, when the light is sufficiently bright to enable one to see the foresight on the rifle. Dew falls like rain in this part of the world, and we had not gone 50 paces in the long grass before we were soaking wet and dismally cold to boot. My guide, cheered by the prospect of a good present, led us confidently along the most intricate paths and through the thickest bush. The moon overhead, which was in its 15th day, gave excellent light. Every now and then some creature would dash across our path, or stand snorting fearfully till we had passed. These were probably water buck and bush buck. Toward 5:30 the light of the moon paled before the first glow of dawn, and we found ourselves on the outskirts of a treeless prairie, dotted here and there with bushes and covered with short dry grass. Across this plain lay the bush where my guide assured me the buffalo slept during the day, and according to him at that moment somewhere between me and this bush wandered at least 100 buffalo. There was little wind, and what there was came in gentle puffs against our right cheeks. I made a sharp detour to the left, walking quickly for some 20 minutes. Then, believing ourselves to be below the line of the buffalo, and therefore free to advance in their direction, we did so. Just as the sun rose we had traversed the plain and stood at the edge of what my men called the Nyumba ya Mbogo, the buffalo's home. We were too late. Fresh signs everywhere showed that my guide had spoken the truth, and now I questioned him as to the bush, how thick it was, etc. At that my men fidgeted uneasily and murmured, "Mr. Dawnay." This young Englishman had been killed by buffalo in the bush but 4 months before. However, 2 of my men volunteered to follow me, and so I set out on the track of the herd. The bush in which the buffalo live is not more than 10 feet high, is composed of a network of branches, and is covered with shiny green leaves, and it has no thorns. Here and there one will meet with a stunted acacia, which, as if to show its spite against its more attractive neighbours, is clothed with nothing but the sharpest thorns. The buffalo, from constant wandering among the bush, have formed a perfect maze of paths, and these trails are wide enough underfoot, but meet just over one's shoulders, so that it is impossible to maintain an upright position. The paths run in all directions, and therefore one cannot see far ahead. Were it not for the fact that here and there, often 200 feet apart, however, are small open patches, it would be almost useless to enter such a fastness. These open places lure one on, as from their edges it is often possible to get a good shot. Once started, we took up the path which showed the most and freshest spoor, and stooping low, pressed on as swiftly and noiselessly as possible. We had not gone far before we came upon a small opening, from the centre of which rose an acacia not more than 8 inches in thickness of trunk, and perhaps 18 feet high. It was forked at the height of a man's shoulder. I carried the 8-bore and was glad of an opportunity to rest it in the convenient fork before me. I had just done so when crash, snort, bellow came several animals, presumably buffalo, in our direction. One gun bearer literally flew up the tree against which I rested my rifle. The other, regardless of consequences, hurled his naked skin against another but smaller tree, also thorny. Both dropped their rifles. I stood sheltered behind 8 inches of acacia wood, with my rifle pointed in front of me and still resting in the fork of the tree. The noise of the herd approached nearer and nearer, and my nerves did not assume that steely quality I had imagined always resulted from a sudden danger. Fly I could not, and the only tree climbable was already occupied, so I stood still. Just as I looked for the appearance of the beasts in the little opening in which I stood, the crashing noise separated into 2 portions, each passing under cover on either side of the opening. I could see nothing, but my ears were filled with the noise. The uproar ceased, and I asked the negro in the tree what had happened. He said when he first climbed the tree he could see the bushes in our front move like the waves of the sea, and then, Hamdulillah, praise be to God, the buffalo turned on either side and left our little opening safe. Had they not turned, but charged straight at us, I fancy I should have had a disagreeable moment. As it was, I began to understand why buffalo shooting in the bush has always been considered unsafe, and began to regret that the road back to the open plain was not a shorter one. We reached it in safety, however, and after a short rest set out upwind. I got a hartebeest and an impala before noon, and then, satisfied with my day, returned to camp. By 4 p.m. my men had brought in all the meat, and soon the little camp was filled with strips of fresh meat hanging on ropes of twisted bark. The next day we exchanged the meat for flour, beans, pumpkins, and Indian corn. I remained in this camp 3 more days, and then returned to Taveta. Each one of these days I attempted to get a shot at buffalo, but never managed it. On one occasion I caught a glimpse of 2 of these animals in the open, but they were too wary to allow me to approach them. When I reached Taveta, I found a capital camp had been built during my absence, and that a food supply had been laid in sufficient for several weeks. Shortly after my arrival I was startled by the reports of many rifles, and soon was delighted to grasp the hands of 2 compatriots, Dr. Abbott and Mr. Stevens. They had just returned from a shooting journey in Masailand, and reported game plenty and natives not troublesome. My intention was then formed to circumnavigate Mount Kilimanjaro, pass over the yet untried shooting grounds, and then to return to the coast. I left 5 men in camp at Taveta in charge of most of my goods, and taking 118 men with me, set out into Masailand. Even at this late date, 1895, the Masai are reckoned dangerous customers. Up to 1889, but 5 European caravans had entered their territory, and all but the last, that of Dr. Abbott, had reported difficulties with the natives. My head man, a capital fellow, had had no experience with these people, and did not look forward with pleasure to making their acquaintance. But he received orders to prepare for a start with apparent cheerfulness. We carried with us 1 ton of beans and dried bananas as food supply. Now, this was sufficient for a few weeks, but laid me under the necessity of doing some successful shooting, should I carry out my plan of campaign. Just on the borders of Masailand live the Usiri people, who inhabit the northeast slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro. We stopped a day or 2 with them to increase our food supply, and while the trading was going on I descended to the plain in search of sport. End of Chapter 1, Part 1.